Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The stagecoach rolled into town just before sundown. Its wheels scraped along the ruts of the main street, scattering dust that clung to windows and boots. Men on the porch of the saloon paused their card game, squinting against the low sun to watch who had arrived. The post office door swung open, and the marshal, leaning on the rail, turned his head for a moment before going back to his pipe. The town was used to seeing strangers come and go, but this time, the stranger was a woman. Her name was Clara Dawson, 25 years old, raised in a textile town back east. She carried a single trunk, plain, scarred by miles of travel, and inside it were 2 dresses, a shawl her mother had sewn, and a bundle of letters folded and refolded until the paper softened. Those letters were from a man she had come here to marry. She had read them so many times she knew each line by memory, though she also knew that a man on paper was different from a man in flesh. Fear pressed in on her as the coach stopped, her hand tightening around the trunk handle. What if he wasn't what he had claimed? What if she couldn't live this far from the world she knew? She had no home to go back to, no family waiting. This was her only chance at building something of her own. Standing near the post office was Ethan Cole, a 34-year-old ranch hand turned deputy. His father had died in a ranch accident when Ethan was young, his mother soon after, and the town had raised him more than any single household. Years of work in the saddle and years riding with the marshal had left his face lined before its time. He wasn't quick with words, not because he lacked thought, but because he didn't trust them to carry weight. Violence, law chasing, and solitude had built a wall around him. The letters he sent to Clara had been short, careful, almost formal. He had never promised wealth or ease, only a roof, steady meals, and the chance for an honest life. It was as much as he believed he could give. When Clara stepped down from the coach, Ethan lifted his hat in greeting. He noticed the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned the street as though measuring whether she could survive here. She noticed the dust on his coat and the wear on his boots. He looked older than his letters suggested, worn by sun and long rides, but there was no arrogance in the way he stood. He picked up her trunk without asking, as if the gesture itself was explanation enough. Neither of them spoke right away. The silence stretched but wasn't careless. It was cautious. Clara's heart raced in her chest, not from romance, but from the weight of decision. She had crossed hundreds of miles for this moment, and now she stood before a man who would decide much of her future. Ethan, on the other hand, felt the old ache of doubt, whether a woman like her could endure his life of long absences and quiet meals. He wondered if he was asking too much of her by bringing her here. They walked through town, past the saloon where the laughter inside spilled into the street, past the blacksmith who raised an eyebrow at the sight of them. Ethan kept his stride measured, so she wouldn't have to hurry. The road thinned until it left the cluster of buildings behind, leading to a weather-worn house on a patch of dry land. The house wasn't grand. 2 rooms, a small barn leaning at the side, and a fence that needed fixing, but it was what he had built with his own hands. Inside, the room smelled of pine and smoke. A table stood bare except for a chipped coffee cup. The bed in the back room was neatly made, as if waiting for judgment. Clara placed her gloves on the table and took a slow breath, steadying her nerves. This was no boarding house, no stop along the road. This was to be her life. Ethan broke the silence at last. His voice was calm, but heavy with intent. The well's clean. Barn's got space for chickens if you want him. I ride with the marshal when needed, so I'm gone some nights. But I'll keep this house steady. Clara nodded, her throat tight. She had expected formality, but not the blunt honesty. She appreciated it, though it frightened her. The truth gave her no illusions to hide behind. For Ethan, the sight of her standing in his doorway with her trunk by her feet brought a strange shift in his chest. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. He realized then that his mission wasn't just to keep law in the territory. His mission, harder, quieter, was to keep this woman safe, to give her the steadiness she had risked everything to find. For Clara, the decision weighed clear. She could let fear push her back into uncertainty, or she could face the life she had come for. She pressed her hands together, steadying her breath. "All right," she said quietly, not as surrender, but as resolve. That night, the prairie wind carried through the shutters, and the silence inside the house was thick. Both of them lay awake, each on their side of the wall of quiet, each wondering if this life could truly begin. The next morning began before sunrise, the sky still gray, and Clara woke to the sound of movement in the kitchen. She lay still for a moment, listening. The faint scrape of boots on wood, the low creak of a chair being shifted. Ethan was already awake, already dressed. She felt a knot of unease in her stomach. This was her first full day in a new life, and it was difficult to decide what her role truly was here. Was she a guest in his house, a stranger he had invited out of duty, or a wife already expected to shoulder half the burdens of this place? When she finally stepped out of the small bedroom, her hair tied back and her dress plain, Ethan was sitting at the table with a tin cup of coffee, papers folded neatly beside him. He glanced up, nodded once in greeting, and poured a second cup without asking. His manners weren't polished, but there was a certain consideration in the way he slid the cup toward her. Clara sat, thanked him softly, and wrapped her hands around the warm metal. The silence stretched, the kind of silence that demanded questions. She had been holding them back since she stepped off the stagecoach. She asked the one that weighed most heavily, "Why did you write for me?" Ethan rested his forearms on the table, his eyes steady but not unkind. "A house needs more than one person to keep it alive. I've been gone too much, and when I come back, it's only walls and a roof. No one waiting. A man can keep chasing lawbreakers, but it doesn't make much of a life. Figured I'd be honest about what I could offer." Clara studied him carefully, feeling the directness of his words. They weren't sweet or flattering, but they were real. She realized that he had not painted a picture of comfort to lure her west. He had given her the truth, and she had accepted it. Now, living inside that truth felt heavier than it had on paper. She confessed her own reason, her voice firmer than she expected. "I came because there was nothing left for me back east. Work in the mills doesn't last. And a woman alone, people look at her like she's already failed. I wanted a place where my hands mattered, where I wasn't just passing time." Ethan gave a slow nod. He understood more than he could easily say. He had known the same looks, the same quiet judgment from townsfolk who thought a man past 30 with no wife and no children was adrift. What she said made sense. She hadn't come chasing fantasies. She had come for the same reason he had written, for survival, for steadiness. After breakfast, he showed her the house in detail, pointing out the pump handle in the yard, the dry cellar under the floor, the barn with its missing slats. He explained that he rode with the marshal when needed, that there would be times he would not be home for a day or two, and that she could lock the shutters and load the small rifle by the door if she felt unsafe. Clara listened, storing each piece of information like bricks laid into place. She was afraid, yes, but the fear wasn't overwhelming. It was the natural fear of someone standing at the edge of a life she hadn't tested yet. She walked through the rooms, slowly once he saddled his horse to check the range. Her fingers brushed along the rough wooden shelves, the empty hooks by the door, the bare wall where no picture hung. She realized then what had unsettled her most. This house was built strong, but it had no trace of softness, no sign that it was lived in beyond necessity. It carried the air of a man who had survived but had not really lived. That afternoon, she unpacked her trunk. She set her mother's shawl over the back of a chair, folded her dresses into the narrow drawers, and placed a small book of Psalms by the bed. These were small things, but they changed how the house felt. It no longer looked like a place waiting for someone. It looked like a place where two people might stay. When Ethan returned at dusk, his boots thick with dust, he paused at the doorway, seeing the changes she had made. His face didn't shift much, but she noticed the way his eyes lingered on the shawl, the way he seemed to breathe a little easier. He didn't say anything about it, but he didn't need to. That night, as they sat at the table with stew Clara had cooked, she asked about his work with the marshal. It was one of the questions that had haunted her since reading his letters. "How dangerous is it? What you do out there?" Ethan set down his spoon. His voice was level, but his jaw tightened slightly. "Sometimes there's danger, yes. Some men run rather than face a rope. But it's less about the gun and more about presence. If they believe you won't back down, most of them don't press the matter. Still, it wears a man down. Clara felt her chest tighten. She had known this truth in vague terms, but hearing it spoken plainly filled her with worry. Yet at the same time, she saw something else. He was not boasting. He was weary of it. That gave her hope that he wanted more than endless pursuit. As the lantern burned low, Clara lay in the small bedroom, her heart unsettled. She thought about what the townsfolk might say when they learned of her arrival, about whether they would see her as an outsider. She thought about Ethan's work, about the risk of him never coming home one evening. But she also thought about the way he had been honest, the way he had sat at the table and listened without rushing her. She told herself that if she could meet each day with the same quiet resolve, she might find her place here. And Ethan, lying awake in the other room, thought about the way her presence had already shifted the house. He thought about the weight of his badge and whether he truly wanted to keep wearing it. For the first time in years, he didn't only measure the danger of the trails, he measured the cost of leaving someone waiting at home. The third day settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar to Clara but necessary. She rose early, just as the first band of light cut across the floorboards. Ethan had already gone outside, his shape moving between the barn and the corral. The sound of the pump handle echoed in the yard, metal against metal, followed by the rush of water hitting a bucket. Clara dressed quickly and stepped outside, realizing that if this was to be her home, she needed to learn how the place lived and breathed. The air carried the sharp scent of horses and dry hay. Ethan was checking the gelding's hooves, his posture bent but steady, and he glanced up briefly when she approached. "Mornin'," he said, before turning back to his work. Clara stood there, feeling a pull between wanting to help and fearing she might get in the way. She asked carefully, "What can I do?" He looked at her directly, weighing her seriousness, then pointed toward the chicken coop. "Could check if any laid this morning. Not much, but it's a start." She nodded and went, her heart thudding harder than such a small task warranted. The coop was small, the boards uneven, but inside she found 2 eggs, warm in the straw. She held them carefully, realizing that this was the first useful thing she had done here. At breakfast, the 2 of them sat again at the table, and this time the silence felt different. Clara noticed he was not just tolerating her presence. He was watching to see what she would do, how she would handle herself. She told him about the eggs, and his lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but enough to ease the tension between them. There were questions still hanging, unspoken since her arrival, and Clara decided to face them before they festered. "What do the people here know about me? About us?" she asked. It was the kind of question a listener would expect, how the town might judge her, whether they would accept her as his wife or treat her as an outsider. Ethan set down his cup. "They know I wrote for a bride. They don't know you yet. Folks here don't always trust new faces quick, but they'll watch. Some will be kind, some won't. That's just how it is." Clara swallowed hard, her pulse rising. She had feared as much. In the mill towns back east, whispers carried sharp edges. Out here, where people live closer to hardship, the judgment might cut even deeper. She asked another question that had been pressing her since she arrived. "What exactly do you do for the marshal? You say you ride with him, but what does that mean? Are you a lawman or just a hand he calls?" Ethan leaned back, his gaze steady. "I'm not sworn like the marshal. Don't with a star. But I've been his second more than once when men needed tracking. Sometimes I carry messages between towns. Sometimes I watch a trail for days. The work is rough, and I don't always bring back good news. That's what I meant when I said I'd be gone some nights." Hearing it spoken plainly filled Clara with unease. She could picture him riding out into wide stretches of land where no one else could hear a shot. She wondered if one day the marshal would come to her door with news she dreaded. She didn't say it, but her hands tightened on the cup. Ethan noticed, and after a pause, he added quietly, "I've lasted this long because I don't rush. I don't take chances I don't have to. That's the truth of it." His words were not meant to comfort her with promises he couldn't keep. They were meant to give her something solid to hold on to. Later that day, Ethan hitched the wagon and showed Clara the route into town. Best you see the place in daylight, get a sense of it, he explained. She agreed, though nerves tightened in her stomach. Riding beside him on the wooden bench, she studied the stretch of dirt road leading into the cluster of buildings she had glimpsed from the stagecoach. The general store smelled of leather, flour, and kerosene. Townsfolk looked up when they entered. A woman near the fabric bolts narrowed her eyes, whispering to another. Clara felt her face grow warm, every stare reminding her that she was marked as someone different. Ethan noticed too, his jaw hardening. He didn't say anything, but his presence alone kept anyone from speaking out loud. At the counter, Ethan introduced her in his simple, direct way. "This is Clara. She'll be keeping the house with me." The storekeeper nodded, polite but reserved. Clara forced a steady smile, speaking only when necessary. The tension in her chest eased only after they were back in the wagon, the town shrinking behind them. That evening, as they put away supplies, Clara asked him the last of the questions that had been left hanging in her mind since she arrived. "Do you expect me to just keep house? Or do you expect more?" Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept her chin up. Ethan turned, setting down a sack of flour. "I expect you to be yourself. Keep the house, yes, but also say what you need. I didn't write to own someone's silence. I wrote because a man can't make a life alone." The words hit her with more weight than she expected. They weren't sentimental, but they were the closest thing to reassurance she had heard since stepping into his world. She felt the knot in her chest loosen just a little. That night, she lay awake again, but this time her thoughts were not only of fear. She thought about the eggs in her hands, the townspeople's glances, and the blunt honesty of Ethan's words. Each piece felt like part of test, and though she wasn't sure she had passed, she knew the life she came for was beginning. Not in grand gestures, but in these small, steady steps. 2 weeks passed, and Clara was beginning to know the rhythm of the land. She had learned how to keep the fire alive through the night, how to draw water from the pump without spilling half the bucket, and how to move carefully around the gelding when he grew restless. Still, there was one thing she could not settle: the silence between herself and Ethan when night fell. They spoke more now, yes, but only about what needed doing: the fence, the animals, the stores in town. What she longed to know was who he really was beneath the duties he carried. The chance came on a day when the sky shifted without warning. Morning was bright, the air sharp and dry. By mid-afternoon, a line of black clouds pressed over the hills. Clara had just set the wash on the line when the first gust bent the cotton and tore at the pins. She hurried to pull the sheets down, heart pounding as the wind picked up grit from the yard. Ethan was gone, riding with the marshal on a short errand, and for the first time she felt the full weight of being alone in the house. She latched the shutters, shoved towels under the door, and sat against the wall listening to the roar of the storm build. The sound of branches snapping echoed across the yard. The roof creaked under the force of the wind. She wrapped her arms around herself, reminding herself that she had chosen this place, this life. Still, the fear crawled up her spine, whispering questions she hadn't dared ask until now. If the roof gave way, if fire struck, if danger came, was she strong enough to handle it? By the time Ethan returned, the storm had already poured itself over the land. His coat and hat were soaked through, and his bay gelding limped from a torn hoof. Clara ran to the doorway, her face pale with relief. "What happened?" she asked, raising her voice over the wind. "Stepped on a nail. Just bad luck," Ethan said, steady as ever. He brought the horse to the barn, and Clara followed with the lantern. Inside, the air was damp, the shadows deep. Ethan crouched by the gelding's leg, examining the wound. "Hold the lamp low," he told her. His voice was calm, but she could see the tension in the lines of his face. Clara's hands shook as she lowered the lamp, the flame throwing long shapes against the barn walls. She had never been this close to an animal in pain before. The gelding stamped once, muscles rippling, and she fought the urge to pull back. Ethan pressed his shoulder against the horse's chest, steadying it with sheer weight. With his free hand, he trimmed the torn flap from the hoof and packed the cut with pine tar. Clara's breath came fast, her nerves raw, but she held the light exactly where he needed it. When the bandage was tied, the gelding breathed easier, sweat glistening on its coat. Ethan straightened, his shirt clinging damp to his back. That should hold him. He'll be fine if he stays off for a few days. His voice carried no pride, only relief. Then he looked at her and said, "You did right. Couldn't have managed it alone." For Clara, those words landed harder than she expected. She had feared being useless here, a burden in a place that required constant labor. In that moment, with the smell of tar and damp wood around them, she realized she was not just a guest. She had been useful. Later, back in the house, Ethan poured her coffee as the storm eased outside. She was still trembling, though she tried to hide it. He noticed. "Storms here come hard, but they don't last," he said. It was his way of reassuring her, though the words came slow and rough. Clara forced herself to voice what she had been holding back since her arrival. "When you're gone with the marshal, and something like this happens again, what if I can't manage? What if I fail?" Her voice cracked slightly at the end. Ethan leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "You won't fail. Fear's natural, but you're not weak. I've seen that already. You'll hold your own." He paused, then added, "I wouldn't have sent for you if I didn't believe it." The honesty in his tone settled her nerves more than any soft promise could have. He wasn't a man to use empty words. He meant what he said, and she believed him. That night, as the rain softened to a steady patter, Clara lay awake listening to the sound of the roof holding steady. She thought about how fear could be faced, not just endured. She thought about how Ethan had looked at her in the barn, not as a burden, not as a stranger, but as someone who stood beside him. For the first time since she stepped off the stagecoach, she felt a fragile thread of belonging begin to take shape. And in the next room, Ethan sat in the chair longer than usual before lying down. He thought about the storm, about the danger in the horse's kick, and about the steadiness in Clara's hands when it mattered. For a man used to silence and his own company, it struck him hard. He was no longer alone in facing what the land demanded. The morning after the storm, the town seemed to wake with a new rhythm. Branches lay scattered along the road, and the river ran higher than usual. Ethan hitched the wagon, saying they needed supplies, flour, kerosene, a new coil of rope. Clara hesitated at the doorway before climbing onto the bench beside him. She had seen the way people looked at her during their last visit. Whispers carried quickly in small towns, and she knew they would be louder now that everyone understood she had come to stay. The ride into town was quiet. Clara sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her mind turning with questions she hadn't dared speak until now. Why had Ethan never married before her? Why had he chosen the badge, even unofficially, instead of a settled ranch life? And what would happen if he kept chasing dangerous men with the marshal? She carried these questions silently, watching the horizon draw closer. The store was busy when they arrived. Women were trading preserves, children tugged at their mothers' skirts, and men leaned on the counter talking about cattle prices. When Clara stepped inside with Ethan, conversation slowed. Some faces softened politely. Others turned away, stiff with judgment. Mrs. Lyle, a rancher's wife known for her sharp tongue, spoke loud enough for half the room to hear. "Mail-order brides," she said, folding fabric. "A shame, really. Bringing strangers out here when we got decent girls right here in town." Clara's face heated. Her hands tightened on the basket she carried. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't come to steal anyone's place, but the words stuck. For a moment, she stood frozen, the weight of every eye pressing on her. Ethan, standing a few paces away, heard it too. He set down the tin of coffee with deliberate calm and turned to Mrs. Lyle. "You've got no cause to speak about what doesn't concern you," he said evenly. His voice wasn't raised, but the room went quiet. "Clara's here because I asked her. That's the only truth that matters." His jaw stayed tight, but his eyes never left hers until she looked away. The silence that followed was heavier than the words had been. Clara felt the rush of both fear and relief. Fear, because she didn't want him making enemies for her sake. Relief, because for the first time she saw him stake his ground not as a deputy, not as a man doing his duty, but as her husband. On the ride home, Clara stared at her hands, still trembling from the encounter. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his voice low. People here don't change quick. They'll watch you, judge you, but you'll outlast them. You already proved it in the storm. Clara turned to him, her voice tight but clear. I don't want you to fight my battles. You didn't ask me to, he said, but I won't stand by when someone spits on you. A man owes more than that. The conversation ended there, but its weight lingered. Back at the house, Clara unpacked the flour and sugar in silence. She thought about Mrs. Lyle's words, about how she would always be seen as someone brought in from outside. The thought stung, but when she remembered Ethan's steady tone, calm, certain, she felt a small measure of strength. That evening, they sat at the table with stew Clara had prepared. She decided to ask one of the questions she had carried since arriving. Why didn't you marry before me? Why wait until now? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, folding his arms. I was always gone, chasing men, keeping order. I didn't want to bring someone into that. Truth is, I thought maybe it was too late for me. I got to thinking a house wasn't worth much if it never felt alive. That's when I wrote. His honesty cut through the uncertainty that had weighed on her. He hadn't chosen her out of desperation. He had chosen her because he was ready to lay down something steadier. For the first time since arriving, Clara allowed herself a fragile sense of belonging. The judgment of the townsfolk would not vanish overnight, but she had seen where Ethan stood, and it gave her something solid to hold on to. That night, as the fire burned low, she lay awake again, not with fear this time, but with thought. The town's eyes would stay sharp, but she could endure it. What mattered was whether she and Ethan could hold together inside these walls. And slowly, she began to believe they could. The days following the tension in town carried a weight that Clara couldn't easily shake. She went about her work with steady hands, sweeping the floors, boiling water, sowing small tears in the feed sacks. But inside, her mind kept circling back to Mrs. Lyle's words and the look she had seen on the faces in the store. She wondered if she would ever stop being the outsider. She wondered if people would ever see her as more than the woman who had come by letter. She didn't say it aloud, but the doubt lingered in every quiet moment. One morning, Clara woke with a heat behind her eyes and a heavy ache in her chest. At first, she tried to ignore it, pushing through the morning tasks, but by midday her knees shook under her, and she nearly dropped the kettle. Ethan caught her arm, steadying her before she fell. His eyes sharpened immediately. Sit, he said firmly, guiding her to the chair. Clara wanted to argue, to insist she could manage, but her body betrayed her with another wave of weakness. Ethan moved quickly, pulling the quilt from the bed and laying it over her shoulders. He fetched water from the pump, boiled it, and pressed a cool cloth against her forehead. His hands, rough from rope and reins, worked with a care she had not expected. For years he had lived alone, a man accustomed to solving problems with grit and silence. Yet now he stayed close, changing the cloth when it grew warm, forcing her to sip water even when she tried to push it away. As the fever climbed, Clara drifted in and out of restless sleep. She remembered faintly the sound of his boots pacing across the floor, the scrape of the chair as he sat beside her through the night. Once, waking suddenly, she saw him slumped forward with his head in his hands, as if weighing fears he couldn't voice. In her haze, she thought, this man who faced outlaws without flinching is afraid of losing me. The fever broke late on the second day, leaving her drained but clear. When she opened her eyes, Ethan was still there, his face drawn, his shirt wrinkled from 2 nights without proper sleep. He straightened when he saw her looking. Relief washed across his expression, though he tried to cover it with a slow breath. You're through the worst of it, he said simply. Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. You stayed. He gave a short nod. Where else would I be? He said it as if no other option had ever existed, though she knew his work with a marshal could have pulled him away. In that moment, she realized something important had shifted. She wasn't just someone keeping his house. She mattered to him in a way he had not yet spoken, but had shown in every cloth he wrung out and every hour he sat through the night. When she grew stronger, she insisted on standing at the pump herself, testing her legs against the handle. Ethan stayed close, his arms crossed, but his eyes never leaving her. She managed to fill half a bucket before she had to stop, breathing hard. "See," she said, forcing a small smile. "I can manage again." Ethan's expression eased, though his voice remained steady. "Don't rush. Strength comes back in its own time." It wasn't an order, but a reminder that she didn't have to prove herself to him. That evening, as they sat at the table with bread and broth, Clara spoke the fear that had haunted her since the fever first came. "If I had died, what would have become of me here? Buried out back without a name. Just another stranger?" Ethan set down his spoon. "No," he said firmly. "Not a stranger. You came here because I asked. That makes you part of this place now. You'd have been buried with my family's name. Same as me." Clara swallowed, her chest tightening. It was the first time he had spoken of her in that way. Not as an outsider, not as someone temporary, but as part of his life, his name, his future. It settled something deep inside her that no defense in the store could have. As the fire burned low, Ethan sat across from her, quieter than usual. He was thinking of how close he had come to losing her before they had even begun. He thought about the badge he carried, about the risks he took with the marshal. For the first time, he questioned if the work was worth leaving someone waiting in this house, someone who had nearly slipped away in 2 short days. And Clara, lying in bed later, thought about the way he had stayed without complaint. For all the silence that still stretched between them, his actions had spoken with clarity. She wasn't alone anymore. By the time Clara regained her strength, the days had grown warmer and the prairie grass shifted in long waves across the open land. She moved about the house with care, still pacing herself, but Ethan no longer hovered as he had during her sickness. He watched quietly instead, and Clara began to notice a subtle change in him. He lingered at home more, rode less with the marshal, and often returned before sundown. It was as if the fever had forced him to weigh his life differently, though he hadn't spoken of it yet. One evening, after supper, they sat outside on the porch. The air was cool, the sky washed with stars. The silence between them felt heavy, not from distance, but from words left unsaid. Clara had carried questions since her arrival, and she realized now was the time to ask them, before they grew into doubts she could not control. "Ethan," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon, "why did you take up work with the marshal in the first place? You said once that you never wore the badge, but you still chose it. Why?" He leaned back against the post, arms crossed, jaw tight. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, in a voice low and measured, he began. "When I was 20, a ranch hand got himself shot in a dispute over stolen cattle. I was there. I carried him back, but he died before we reached town. The marshal saw I could keep my head when others couldn't, and he asked me to ride with him. At first, I thought it was right, keeping order, standing where others wouldn't. But the years, they take something from you. Every outlaw caught, every grave dug, it piles up." He paused, looking down at his hands, rough and scarred. "That's why I stayed away from marriage. I didn't think a woman should live with that weight on her doorstep. By the time I wrote you, I realized the chasing didn't matter as much as coming home to something worth keeping." Clara listened carefully, her chest tightening with both sorrow and understanding. She had always wondered why a man like him, steady, capable, hadn't settled long before. Now she knew it wasn't because he couldn't. It was because he feared destroying whatever peace a family might bring. She wanted to ease that fear, but words felt clumsy. Instead, she reached out and set her hand on the rail close to his, letting the quiet acknowledgement speak first. After a while, she shared her own truth. "Back east, I worked in a textile mill. Long hours, poor air, wages barely enough to live. I had a younger brother, Samuel. He was 16 when a machine caught him. They carried him out in a sheet. After that, my mother hardly spoke a word for a year. I tried to hold us together, but everything came apart. The mill was all I had, and even that barely kept me alive. When I saw your notice, I knew people would call it desperate. Maybe it was, but I couldn't spend another year waiting for nothing to change. I wanted a place where my hands meant something." Ethan turned his head then, studying her in the dim light. His eyes softened, though his voice remained steady. "You've lost more than I thought." "So have you," she said, meeting his gaze. "Maybe that's why we understand each other. even without saying much. The truth of that hung between them. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like a wall. It felt like ground they both stood on, scarred but solid. Inside the house later that night, Clara closed the bedroom door behind her with a firm motion. It was not a gesture of retreat, but of decision. She had chosen to step fully into the life they had promised each other, not as strangers bound by letters, but as two people who had carried loss and still wanted to build something steady. Ethan, standing in the main room, heard the latch click. He sat still for a long moment, the sound ringing louder in his chest than any gunfire on the trail ever had. When he finally pushed the chair back and walked toward that door, he did so without hesitation. Not because the silence between them was broken, but because it had finally spoken what both of them had needed to hear. The days after Clara and Ethan shared their pasts carried a new weight between them. Not heavy in burden, but solid in the way two people feel once they have crossed from strangers into something closer to family. Clara moved about the house with more assurance, no longer uncertain about whether she belonged. Ethan, for his part, spent more evenings at home, as if some invisible tether kept him close. Still, the land and the work of keeping law didn't wait for a man's private life. Trouble had a way of circling back. It came first as a whisper in town. Clara overheard it at the general store when she went alone to trade eggs and flour. Two ranch hands spoke near the counter, not lowering their voices. "That deputy's too busy playing house," one said. "He's not got the grit to ride with the marshal anymore." The other laughed. "A mail-order bride made him soft, but he'll put down the badge before winter." Clara felt her chest tighten, her hands gripping the basket until the wicker dug into her palms. She wanted to snap back, to defend Ethan, but she forced herself to walk away. Still, their words clung to her the whole ride home. She wondered if Ethan knew people were questioning him, and if he did, how it cut at him. She didn't have to wait long to find out. That evening, two riders showed up at the edge of their yard just as the sun dropped. They sat their horses loosely, dust masks hanging at their throats. Their posture, too, relaxed to be casual. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his presence calm but unyielding. Clara stood just inside the door, watching through the thin curtain, her heart pounding. One of the riders called out, "We're looking to cross north without bother. Heard the marshals got men watching the river. You know, Cole. Tell us straight." Ethan's voice carried steady, not loud, but sharp enough to cut the distance. "Road north is watched. River's worse. You don't want that way." The second rider smirked, letting his gaze drift toward the house. "Funny. You sound like a man who'd rather stay home these days. Maybe that bride of yours keeps you too tied down to care what happens out here." Clara's breath caught. Her stomach knotted in fear, not just of the men, but of how Ethan might react. She had seen him calm under pressure, but this was different. This was personal. Ethan shifted the rifle slightly, just enough to make the message plain. "Curiosity about my house is a poor use of your time. You've had your answer. Take the lower trail." For a moment, the air hung thick. Clara could hear her own pulse in her ears. Then, slowly, the riders pulled their horses aside, turning down toward the brush. One spat in the dirt, but neither pressed further. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only the creak of the porch boards under Ethan's boots. When he came inside, Clara was still standing stiff near the window. Her hands trembled, but she tried to steady her voice. "They knew about me." Ethan set the rifle back in its place, his eyes meeting hers with deliberate calm. "People talk. They want to test if I'd bend. I didn't." She swallowed hard. "What if they come back? Then I'll be here," he answered simply. But Clara could see in the way his jaw tightened that he was thinking further ahead, that every choice he made now carried weight not just for himself, but for her as well. That night, as they ate by lamplight, Clara broke the silence. "When I first came, I wondered if you truly wanted me here, or if you only wanted someone to keep house. After today, I know. You didn't just guard the land. You guarded me." Ethan looked at her across the table, the light catching the lines of his face. "That's what it means now. This house, this life, it's not just mine anymore. It's ours." For Clara, the word struck deeper than any defense in town could have. It wasn't about what others said. It was about what Ethan had chosen to stand for. And tonight, he had made it clear she was no outsider. She was the reason he stood firm. Later, lying awake, Clara thought about the riders, about the smirk in their voices, and the way Ethan had not flinched. She also thought about the gossip in the store and the way people whispered about him being soft. She realized that the life they were building would always be tested, from storms, from sickness, from strangers. But she also realized something else. For the first time since leaving the East, she wasn't afraid of being alone in it. And Ethan, watching the fire burn low, thought about the badge. He thought about whether chasing men on the river and the plains mattered more than the woman sleeping under his roof. For the first time, the answer didn't feel uncertain. The days after the riders tested their home left Ethan restless. He patched a section of fence, mended harness leather, and repaired a loose board in the barn, but Clara could tell his thoughts weren't on the work in front of him. His movements were deliberate, heavier than usual, like a man measuring every choice. She didn't press him, but she noticed. She knew what he was weighing, because she had carried the same fear since the day she first heard of his work with the marshal. The fear that the law would take him from her before their life together had a chance to truly begin. That evening, when the sun dropped low and the yard fell quiet, Ethan finally spoke. He sat at the table with his coffee untouched, the cup cooling in his hand. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about the badge, about what it costs." Clara set down the sewing she'd been working on, her eyes fixed on him. He rarely opened his thoughts without reason. "And?" she asked carefully. He took a long breath. "I've given years to chasing men. It made sense when I had nothing waiting for me. But now, things are different. Every time I ride out, I'm not just risking myself anymore. I'm leaving you behind with the worry. That's not what I promised when I asked you here." Clara felt her chest tighten. It was the question she had carried silently since the night of her fever. Would he ever step away from that life? Would he choose them over the badge? She searched his face, trying to measure if he truly meant it or if this was only passing doubt. Ethan continued, "The marshal asked me to ride north next week. Says some men are stirring near the river again. I told him no. Told him I'd see this season through, then I'm done." His eyes locked on hers. "I want to put the badge down, Clara. I want to build this place with you. Full, not halfway." The weight of his words struck her harder than she expected. She thought of Mrs. Lyle's whispers in the store, the way townsfolk had mocked him for being softened by her presence. If they saw him lay down the badge, some would call it weakness. Yet Clara knew the truth. It was not weakness to choose peace. It was strength to turn away from a life that had hollowed him. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "If you do this," she asked softly, "will you regret it? Will you look at me one day and think I cost you the life you knew?" Ethan shook his head, steady. "No, I'm tired of being half a man here and half out there. I want one life. Ours. That's the only work I'm choosing now." Clara's hands trembled as she reached across the table, resting her fingers lightly over his. "Then I'll stand with you in it," she whispered. The decision, spoken plain, shifted the air in the house. For the first time, the future no longer hung in doubt. Theirs would not be a life defined by outlaws, danger, or endless nights apart. It would be a life built in the soil, in the steady work of fence lines and bread rising, in the quiet strength of a house that belonged to both of them. The next morning, Ethan rode into town one last time to meet the marshal. Clara watched him go, her heart tight, but when he returned before sundown, his face was lighter than she had seen in months. He said little about the conversation. Only, "It's done. He understands." That night, they sat on the porch with coffee in hand, the stars wide overhead. Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the steadiness of his choice settle over them. Ethan stayed quiet, but she knew his silence now was different. It wasn't the silence of distance, but of a man finally at rest. Inside, the badge lay tucked in a drawer, no longer at his belt. The house, the land, and the life they had begun together. That was his mission now. The decision to set the badge aside changed everything between Ethan and Clara, though it wasn't spoken of daily. The weight that had once lingered in the house seemed to lift. He woke earlier now, not to ride out at the marshal's call, but to tend to the land. Clara noticed the difference in his gait when he came back from the barn, the steadiness of a man no longer split between two lives. Still, one thing remained unfinished. Their union had never been made official in the eyes of the town. They lived together, worked together, but the community still saw Clara as the woman brought by letter, not a wife with a rightful place. It was Clara who brought it up one evening as they shelled beans by lamplight. "Ethan," she said carefully, "if we mean to stay, we should do this proper. The people here will keep whispering otherwise. I don't want to give them reason to think I don't belong." Ethan set aside the bowl and looked at her. He hadn't been one to care much for appearances, but he understood the weight of her words. He had seen her shoulders stiffen in town, heard the whispers himself. "You're right," he said. "No more talk. We'll marry here, plain and honest." The wedding was small, held on a Sunday morning in the back room of the church. The preacher read simple words, the kind that carried more truth than ceremony. Clara wore the dress she had traveled in, mended neatly at the seams, and Mrs. Howard, the preacher's wife, placed a fresh sprig of wildflowers in her hair. Ethan wore his only clean coat, pressed as best as he could manage. The congregation was small, neighbors who had once questioned her presence, the marshal who shook Ethan's hand firmly, and a few ranch wives who brought bread and preserves as gifts. When the vows were spoken, Clara felt her throat tighten. For all the storms, the fever, the whispers, and the doubts, here was the moment she had hoped for when she stepped off the stagecoach. Not the promise of wealth, not the fantasy of romance, but the steady truth of belonging. When Ethan said, "I do," his voice carried the weight of a man who meant every word. Afterward, the neighbors gathered at their house, leaving gifts both practical and kind: a coil of rope for the barn, a basket of eggs, a pair of milk cows from a rancher who said every family needed them. Clara stood by the table, accepting each with a grateful smile, while Ethan thanked each man with the grip of his hand. By the end of the day, their home no longer felt like a place on the edge of town. It felt connected, recognized, and real. As the weeks passed, Clara planted her first kitchen garden, straight rows of beans and onions pushing through the soil. Ethan built her a proper porch, board by board, until they could sit outside in the evenings without the dust creeping in. Each task was small on its own, but together they transformed the house into something new, a place that carried both of their hands in its shape. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Clara leaned against Ethan on the porch, listening to the quiet hum of the land. "When I first came here," she admitted, "I was afraid I'd never belong. Afraid I'd always be the outsider people whispered about." Ethan rested his arm around her shoulders. "And now," she looked out at the garden, the fence line, the smoke rising from the chimney that was theirs alone. "Now I know I do. Not because of them. Because of us." Ethan nodded slowly. For a man of few words, he didn't need to say more. The truth was plain enough. The restless lawman who once measured his life by the miles he rode now measured it by the sound of her steps in the kitchen, the weight of her hand on his arm, and the steady work they shared. Their story, once uncertain, closed on solid ground. The mail-order bride was no longer a stranger, and the cowboy was no longer a man chasing dust. Together, they had built a life that belonged to them both, a home filled not with silence, but with the quiet strength of love that stayed.